Close your eyes for a moment and let your imagination carry you away. Imagine you are no longer in your room. You are standing in the middle of a 14th century market. The air around you is a mixture of many scents. The smell of spices from the distant east, mingled with the smell of leather, of wood, and of cooking smoke. You hear the clatter of wheels on a dirt road, the sound of people speaking in foreign tongues, and the calls of street vendors. This is a world in motion. A vast network of trade routes is connecting civilizations. From China all the way to Europe, goods, money, and people are constantly on the move. But look closer. In that bustling flow, something else is also moving. An invisible passenger, with no ticket, no name. It follows the caravans of camels, hides within bales of silk, and boards the merchant ships as they set sail. It is a shadow, silently making its own journey from Asia to Europe. Tonight, our journey is to follow that very shadow. We will be time travelers to witness firsthand the most silent yet devastating conquest in history, and to uncover the mystery of a name that the world would later tremble to speak. The Black Death. Part 1. The Mystery of Origin. A Search in the Mist. Every journey of discovery begins with a question of origin. Every great river has a small source somewhere. With the Black Death, tracing that source is the first and most difficult mystery. It is like a great investigation, spanning centuries, with scattered clues and theories that are still debated. Historians and scientists, like detectives of time, have tried to turn back every faded page of history, analyze every ancient bone fragment to find where the pathogen hid before it rose up and began its conquest. The mist of history conceals this answer very carefully. One of the oldest theories takes us to a vast and wild land in the heart of the Eurasian continent. Let's try to imagine a vast space where green steppes stretch to the horizon and then suddenly give way to the aridity of the Great Gobi Desert. This is a land of harshness, of howling winds, and of near absolute silence. The great explorer Marco Polo, on his journey, once described this place as a bewitching land, where a lonely traveler could hear the voices of demons in the wind or see strange illusions appear from the air. Perhaps, in that very wildness and mystery, an ancient bacterium found an ideal refuge. It did not live in the air or in the sand, but in the bodies of small creatures, wild rodents like the marmot or the prairie dog. For thousands of years, it might have existed there, in a closed biological cycle, a balance of nature, transmitted only between animals, and having no effect on the human world thousands of miles away. It was a secret, guarded by the vastness of the steppe. But then, archaeologists found other clues, leading the search to a more specific location, a small point of light in the mist. On the shores of Lake Issyk-Kul, a turquoise gem nestled among the majestic mountains of modern-day Kyrgyzstan. Lake Issyk-Kul is one of the deepest and largest lakes in the world. Its name means warm lake because it never freezes, even in the harsh winters of Central Asia. Near this lake, archaeologists have excavated an ancient cemetery of the Nestorians, a branch of Christianity. Here, they found tombstones dating from the years 1338 and 1339, just a few years before the pandemic erupted in Europe. What was unusual was that the number of tombstones in these 2 years increased dramatically. And on some tombstones, the cause of death was clearly inscribed in the ancient Syriac language as pestilence. This was a significant discovery, a rare ray of light. Could this be the point of origin, where the pathogen first crossed the boundary from animals to humans and caused the first recorded mass deaths? Could it be that merchants on the Silk Road passing through this lake region unknowingly carried the pathogen with them and began to spread it on their journey to the west. This theory is very compelling, but it is still not the final answer. The truth is, we may never know for certain which was the first village, which was the first person to fall, because history is written by the victors and by those who are literate. The stories of the nomadic people, of the small villages on the steppe, are often forgotten, vanishing into the wind. The origin of the Black Death, therefore, remains an open question, a whisper in history that we can only guess at. It is like a mythical creature. We do not know its exact lair. We only know one thing for sure. In the middle of the 14th century, it awoke, and the world at that time seemed to have been perfectly prepared, almost as if it were arranged, to welcome its arrival. Part 2. The Perfect Storm. The second mystery, a mystery of a larger scale, lies not in the question from where, but how. How could a pathogen from a remote region create a global pandemic of such a scale? Unprecedented in history. The answer lies not in a single cause, but in the convergence of many different factors, like small streams flowing into a great river, creating a terrifying flood. Historians call this the perfect storm. Let's analyze each element together, each cloud that contributed to this storm. The first cloud is named connection. Before the 13th century, the world was a collection of relatively isolated civilizations. But then, the rise of the Mongol Empire changed everything. From the Pacific coast to the gates of Europe, the Mongols conquered and unified a territory of unprecedented size. And on that land, they established a new order, a relative peace known as the Pax Mongolica, or Mongol peace. Under this peace, the ancient trade routes, especially the Silk Road, were vigorously revived. Travel became safer. Merchants could now travel thousands of miles with few obstacles. Let's try to imagine its bustling activity. Caravans of camels laden with brocades and porcelain from China. Persian merchants with spices and precious carpets. European traders seeking luxury goods. They met at oases, at way stations, exchanging not only goods but also culture. To manage this vast empire, the Mongols also created a super-fast communication system called the Yam, a medieval form of the Pony Express, with riders galloping non-stop to deliver messages. This connection was the lifeblood of prosperity, but it was also the ideal highway for anything that could spread. A pathogen appearing in Central Asia could now follow a merchant to Persia, then board a ship on the Black Sea and arrive in Europe in just a few months. The second cloud is urbanization and population boom. To the west of the Silk Road, Europe was experiencing prosperous times. Centuries of warm and stable climate had brought bountiful harvests. More abundant food meant that the population grew rapidly, estimated to have peaked at around 75 to 80 million people. More and more people left the countryside to flock to the growing cities, seeking opportunities. Cities like Florence, Venice, Paris, London became overwhelmingly crowded. But urban planning at that time could not keep up with this pace. The streets were often narrow, winding, without sidewalks. Houses were built close together, often of wood and clay, blocking out the sunlight. And most importantly, there was no effective system for waste and sewage disposal. People often had the habit of throwing all sorts of garbage out the window onto the street. The streets became open sewers, foul and filthy. This was a paradise for a small but resilient creature. The third cloud, and also the darkest one, is the perfect biological trio. Let's take a closer look at each member of this trio. The first member, the main culprit, is the bacterium Yersinia pestis, a single-celled organism, an ancient life form. With the sole purpose of surviving and multiplying, it has sophisticated mechanisms to evade the host's immune system, and turns the body's own lymphatic system into its new home. The second member is the vector, the oriental rat flea. It is not just a simple bloodsucker, but a perfectly designed tool of infection. When Yersinia pestis invades and blocks its digestive tract, the flea enters a state of perpetual hunger. It bites more aggressively, and with each bite, it regurgitates the bacterial blockage into the new victim's blood. And the third member, the most important for connecting the bacterial world with the human world, is the black rat, or Rattus rattus. This is not the large sewer rat we often see today. It is smaller, but agile and an excellent climber. It can climb nearly vertical walls, squeeze through the smallest cracks, and survive a fall from several stories high. Most importantly, it loves to live near humans, in houses, on ships, in granaries. It is a perfect bridge, a mobile vehicle for fleas and bacteria. As the Silk Road developed, black rats followed the cargo, migrating westward. They carried uninvited guests on their backs, and when they arrived in the crowded, unsanitary cities of Europe, they found a new home, an ideal environment to thrive and multiply. All the elements were in place: global connection, crowded cities, and a deadly biological trio. The perfect storm had formed. It was only waiting for a flash of lightning to strike the world, and that flash came from a distant port city where the east and west collided. Kaffa, the tragic gate. Our journey of discovery now will take us to a specific place, a place where history seems to have turned in a different direction. Let us go to the Crimean Peninsula on the gentle shores of the Black Sea. Here, there was a city named Kaffa. In the middle of the 14th century, Kaffa was not just a city. It was a symbol of the rise of commerce and the power of the Italian city-states. It was originally just a small, rustic fishing village, but the talented and daring merchants from the city of Genoa saw its potential. They turned Kaffa into a bustling international port, a precious gem on the map of trade. Let's try to imagine Kaffa at its peak. A population of 80,000 people. Tall buildings rose side by side, churches with soaring spires. Its harbor could accommodate up to 200 ships at once, a truly impressive sight. The atmosphere in Kaffa's markets was always bustling, with all sorts of languages being exchanged. Silk from China, spices from India, furs from the north, and wine, olive oil from the Mediterranean. Kaffa was the gate, where the East met the West, a melting pot of culture and commerce. But Kaffa's prosperity was built on land that did not belong to them. The Crimean region at that time was under the rule of the Golden Horde, a powerful branch of the Mongol Empire. The Genoese were only allowed to do business here because they brought profit to the Mongol Khans. This relationship, already fragile, became more strained over the years due to conflicts over economy, religion, and the arrogance of the European merchants. And then, a small spark ignited a great fire. In a nearby trading city called Tana, a brawl in a market street between a Muslim and an Italian ended in bloodshed. The story spread and reached the ears of the ruling Mongol Khan, a man named Johnny Beg. Under the pretext of defending the Islamic faith, and also to reassert his authority, Johnny Beg led a formidable Mongol Tartar army to besiege the Italian cities. After conquering Tana, some survivors fled to Kaffa to make a stand. Johnny Beg's army pursued them closely, and soon, the fortified city of Kaffa was surrounded on all sides. The Genoese people inside the city were initially very confident. They had high and sturdy city walls, enough food and water to hold out for a long time. They looked at the besiegers outside and waited. They waited for the Mongol army to get tired and withdraw. But they did not know that another enemy, 1,000 times more dangerous, was also approaching, not from the front, but from behind the Mongol army itself. The pestilence, which had been silently following the Silk Road, had finally reached Crimea. It infiltrated the very camp of the besieging army. The Mongol soldiers, known for their combat prowess and bravery, began to fall in droves. Not because of the Genoese swords, but because of a strange fever, coughing up blood, and painful black swellings on their bodies. To those defending inside Kaffa, this seemed like a miracle. They believed that it was the punishment of God, sent down upon the heathens who were attacking them. They mocked the enemy from the city walls. But their joy was short-lived. Outside, the situation for the Mongol army became desperate. The number of dead was so great they could not be buried in time. Bodies were piled up, and a thick, foul stench rose, covering the entire area. Johnny Beg, in his rage and desperation, made a decision that history would later record as one of the first acts of biological warfare. He ordered his soldiers to load the decomposing bodies of their comrades onto giant catapults. And then they launched them over the city walls into the crowded streets of Kaffa. Let's try to imagine the horror of the people inside. Their sky suddenly rained down not with stones, but with human corpses. When these bodies hit the houses and streets, they burst apart, scattering fragments and pathogens everywhere. Johnny Beg's initial purpose was perhaps only to terrorize and to pollute the air, to force the city to surrender. But its true consequence was far worse. The rats, which were living in the Mongol camp, followed the scent of death. They found their way into the city, through drains, through cracks, and on their backs were fleas laden with plague bacteria. The pathogen had officially breached the final wall. Inside Kaffa, the scene was now no different from the outside. People began to run a fever, to cough, and the black swellings appeared. Confidence and mockery turned into absolute terror. The city descended into chaos. The siege ended. Not because one side won, but because both sides were being destroyed. Those with the last of their strength, both Genoese and local inhabitants, rushed to the harbor. It was the only way out. They pushed and shoved, fighting each other to get onto the merchant ships at anchor. They set sail, leaving behind a dying city with the hope of a new beginning in their homeland. They did not know that they were not the only ones on board. In the dark, damp cargo holds, the uninvited guests had also begun their own journey, a journey to spread darkness across the entire Mediterranean world. The tragic gate had been thrown wide open. Part 4. The Winter's Curse and the Mystery of Transmission. The sails were raised in haste. The Genoese ships, heavy with fear, left the port of Kaffa, leaving behind a dying city. On deck, the survivors looked towards the western horizon, where their homeland awaited. They carried a fragile hope that they had escaped the nightmare. But they had not escaped. They had simply brought the nightmare with them. Because the true mystery of the Black Death lies not only in its origin, but also in its sophisticated and cruel mechanism of transmission, a mechanism that the people of that time could not possibly understand. Let us delve deeper into this biological mystery, one of the keys to deciphering its destructive power. As the ships crossed the Black Sea and entered the Bosphorus Strait, they passed by one of the greatest cities in the world. Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire, a city of silk, gold, and magnificent church domes. When the goods and sailors from Kaffa came ashore, they brought with them invisible passengers. Just a few weeks later, the first citizens of Constantinople began to fall ill. The initial symptoms seemed like a common flu: high fever, chills, and a feeling of utter exhaustion. But then, the characteristic signs began to appear. In the soft areas of the body, such as the armpits, groin, or neck, the lymph nodes began to swell, forming painful lumps, which the Italians called buboes. These tumors could grow to the size of an egg or even an apple, their skin turning a dark purple, then black. This was the most common form of the disease, known as bubonic plague. It is caused when an infected flea bites a person and injects Yersinia pestis bacteria into the blood. From the bite, the bacteria begin their journey, traveling through the lymphatic system, a defense network of the body, and turning that very network into a path of invasion. They congregate in the lymph nodes, the garrisons of the immune system, and turn them into new bacteria factories, causing inflammation and necrosis. This is the face of the Black Death in the warm months. When fleas are most active, it needs a vector, a bite, to be transmitted. But this is only half of the mystery. After leaving Constantinople, the phantom ships continued their journey. In October of 1347, they arrived at the port of Messina on the island of Sicily. The local people, upon seeing the dying sailors with black swellings, were horrified and ordered the ships to leave immediately. A reasonable decision, but it was too late. The rats had managed to find their way ashore, and the disease had begun to plant its seeds in the new land. From Messina, it spread throughout Sicily, then crossed the sea to mainland Italy, beginning its march north. And as winter began to descend upon Europe, a great question, another mystery, arose. Why didn't the epidemic stop? Logically, as the weather turned cold, fleas should have become less active or died off. The main transmission route should have been cut. But no, the Black Death continued its advance, even becoming more ferocious in some places. This is when it revealed its second face, a much more terrifying one. Once the Yersinia pestis bacteria had conquered the lymph nodes, they did not stop there. In some cases, they continued their invasion deep into the body and reached one of the most vital organs, the lungs. Once inside the lungs, the bacteria transformed into a new form of the disease, known as pneumonic plague. In this form, the story of fleas and rats was no longer necessary. The pathogen could now be transmitted directly from person to person. It existed in tiny droplets, expelled into the air when a sick person coughed, sneezed, or even breathed heavily. A healthy person merely had to inhale that air to become infected. Pneumonic plague was almost a certain death sentence. Symptoms appeared very quickly. The patient coughed up blood, and the respiratory system collapsed within a matter of days. The mortality rate was nearly 100%. And this is the solution to the winter's curse. During the cold months, the people of Europe tended to gather indoors, huddling around fires for warmth, in cramped, poorly ventilated spaces. They did not know that this very habit created an ideal environment for pneumonic plague to spread. Every house, every tavern, every church could become a hotbed of infection. Every breath could carry the seeds of death. The Black Death seemed to have a perfect dual strategy. In the summer, it traveled on the backs of rats and through the bites of fleas, moving from city to city along trade routes. In the winter, when its vectors weakened, it switched to a direct assault, turning humans themselves into the means of transmission. It didn't stop there. It had a third face, rarer but also the most lethal. That is septicemic plague. In this case, the bacteria did not just colonize the lymph nodes or lungs, but flooded directly into the bloodstream in enormous numbers. The victim's body went into systemic septic shock. The internal organs shut down, and large hemorrhages appeared under the skin, causing the skin to turn black. This may be the origin of the name, the Black Death. With this form of the disease, no one survived, and death could come in just a few hours, so quickly that many people didn't even have time to develop clear symptoms. A person could be perfectly healthy in the morning and be dead by evening. This diversity in its forms of attack is one of the greatest mysteries of the Black Death's power. It was not a monotonous enemy, but one capable of transformation, adapting to all conditions to ensure its own survival and spread. Understanding this mystery is the only way we can understand why. Once it had set foot in Europe, no army, no city wall, and no prayer could stop its advance. Part 5. The True Face of Fear. Faced with an enemy of such destructive power and transformative ability, an enemy that was invisible, inexplicable, how did humans react? The greatest mystery of the Black Death perhaps lies not in biology, but in human psychology itself. When all the foundations of society, from knowledge to faith to family relationships, are shaken to their very core, what will rise from the depths of our souls? Our next journey will take us to explore the diverse and complex reactions of human beings, to discover the true faces of fear. The first face is the impotence of knowledge. European medicine in the Middle Ages, which was built on the theoretical foundations of ancient Greek masters like Hippocrates and Galen, completely collapsed. The theory of the four humors in the body, which held that illness occurred when blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile were out of balance, could not explain this strange disease. The doctors, the most educated and respected people in society, tried every method they knew. They performed bloodletting, hoping to remove bad blood. But this only weakened the patients further. They used red-hot irons to cauterize the swollen buboes, a method of excruciating pain, but rarely effective. They prescribed strange concoctions made from rare herbs, powdered unicorn horn, or even human excrement, with a desperate belief that they might work. This impotence gave birth to an iconic image, an image both frightening and pitiful. That is the plague doctors. Let us imagine them again in more detail. They wore a long leather coat, waxed or oiled, with the hope that it could prevent the miasma from seeping in. They wore leather gloves, tall boots, and a wide-brimmed hat, and most distinctively, the mask with a bird-like beak. This hollow beak was not to frighten, but was a primitive form of gas mask. They stuffed it with strong-smelling herbs like mint, camphor, or lavender, believing that these pure scents could filter the toxic air before they breathed it in. The eye holes of the mask were covered with red glass because it was believed that the color red could ward off disease. They carried a long wooden stick, not for support, but to be able to examine patients, to lift their clothing, or to keep a safe distance from others. They were the embodiment of the last effort of human knowledge, an effort built on false assumptions, but born of courage and responsibility. The second face of fear is the extremity of faith. When knowledge failed, people turned to faith. The churches were always full. Prayer services were held day and night. Processions of holy relics were carried through the streets. But as the pestilence continued to spread and the death toll rose, the faith of many began to waver, while others became more extreme. This was the rise of the flagellant movement, the self-flagellators. They believed that the Black Death was the wrath of God, and the only way to appease that wrath was to endure physical pain, to atone for the sins of humanity. Processions of people, numbering in the hundreds, even thousands, walked barefoot from city to city. They wore white robes, covered their faces, and carried terrible leather whips with multiple cords tipped with sharp metal fragments. Twice a day, they would gather in the square of the towns they passed through. They would lie on the ground in the shape of a cross and begin their ritual. They would stand up and use those whips to scourge their own backs and chests while chanting mournful hymns until the blood flowed freely. This spectacle caused a great psychological shock to the local people. Some were horrified and shunned them, but many others saw them as living saints and rushed into the streets to kiss their wounds, asking for a blessing. Sadly, These actions, and their pilgrimage itself, unintentionally help the disease to spread faster. They are a mystery of crowd psychology, an expression of ultimate desperation, when people are willing to do the most extraordinary things, to find a ray of hope, however faint. The third phase, and also the darkest of fear, is the search for a scapegoat. When faced with a tragedy too large and incomprehensible, one of the instinctive human reactions is to find someone or something to blame. A simple explanation for a complex and terrifying world. And in medieval Europe, the target of this blame was often the Jewish communities. They were a minority group with different customs and religion living separately in their own quarters. Difference always easily gives rise to suspicion. Baseless rumors began to spread like a mental contagion. People said that the Jews were not affected by the plague. Although this was not true, they also died in great numbers. And then the most terrible rumor appeared that they themselves had caused the pandemic by poisoning the public wells in a global conspiracy to destroy Christendom. The fear and confusion of the crowd, when ignited by these accusations, erupted into a fire of hatred. A series of attacks and massacres against Jews took place across Europe, especially in the lands of France and Germany. In Strasbourg, thousands of Jews were herded into a cemetery and burned alive. In many other cities, they were brutally tortured to force them to confess to crimes they did not commit before being executed. This is one of the darkest and saddest chapters in the entire story of the Black Death. It is a mystery of social psychology, showing how fear and ignorance, when combined, can create a monster even more terrifying than the disease itself. There were still glimmers of light in the darkness. Pope Clement VI issued a papal bull declaring that the Jews were innocent and that the pestilence affected them just as it did others. The King of Poland, Casimir the Great, opened his arms to welcome Jewish refugees. But these humanitarian actions were in the minority. Most of Europe was engulfed in a madness of blame. All these faces, impotence, extremity, cruelty, and also courage, are the pieces that make up the complex picture of the human response to a world that was falling apart. Part 6. Crossing the Channel, the ultimate trial. By the late summer of 1348, the Black Death had conquered almost the entire European continent. It stood before its final obstacle in the west, the English Channel. To the people of England, the terrible news coming from the continent still seemed very far away. England at that time was in a rather optimistic mood. Their king, Edward III, was a popular ruler. Just 2 years earlier, in 1346, the English army had won a glorious victory against the French in the Battle of Crécy, opening the 100 Years' War. The victorious soldiers brought back spoils of war, and national pride was high. England's economy, especially the wool trade, was thriving. English wool was considered the best in Europe and was exported everywhere. This very prosperity and commercial connection would unintentionally become their Achilles heel. Merchant ships continued to travel back and forth between England and ports on the continent, like Calais in France or the cities of Flanders. They took wool away and brought back wine, goods, and also uninvited guests. In the summer of 1348, the Shadow officially crossed the Channel. It did not arrive by a single route, but like a multi-pronged landing. Historians record that the first cases appeared almost simultaneously at ports on the southern coast, such as Southampton, Portsmouth, and a small port called Melcombe, now part of Weymouth. Another front seems to have started from Bristol in the west, possibly from a ship carrying French wine. Immediately, the disease showed a particularly ferocious power in this new land. A local monk described that a cruel death took just 2 days to break out all over town. For many, it came as suddenly as a scythe of death. From these two beachheads, the pestilence began to advance inland. along the well-established road and river systems. And here, another mystery arises. Why did the Black Death in England seem more devastating and have a higher mortality rate than the average on the continent? While in Europe, the mortality rate was estimated at around 30 to 40%. In England, this figure is believed to have exceeded 50%, perhaps even reaching 60%. Nearly two-thirds of the population vanished in just over a year. There's no certain answer, but historians offer a few theories. First, it could be that the network of roads and villages in England was more densely connected, making it easier for the disease to move from place to place without many natural barriers. Second, the English population may not have had any prior exposure to this strain of bacteria, leaving their immune systems completely unprepared. And third, it could simply have been bad luck that a particularly virulent variant of the bacterium had landed on the island. Whatever the cause, the consequences were utterly tragic. The Black Death cut a swath of destruction from south to north. Bustling villages fell silent. Weeds began to grow on the paths. Nature gradually reclaimed what humans had occupied. Many industries, such as mining or construction, had to cease operations because there were no more workers. Golden fields of wheat were left unharvested, and livestock died by the thousands in the pastures because there was no one to care for them. In the autumn of 1348, the two fronts of the epidemic merged and advanced on the kingdom's largest city, London. London at that time was a vibrant city, but also incredibly filthy and crowded, with a population of about 80 to 100,000 people. It became a perfect target. The pestilence attacked London with a deadly 1-2 punch, true to its dual strategy. First was the pneumonic plague, spreading rapidly in the cold autumn and winter as people huddled indoors. Then, in the spring and summer of 1349, as the weather warmed, the bubonic plague returned, along with the explosion of the rat and flea populations. More than half of London's population was gone forever. But the journey of darkness was not yet over. It continued northward, crossing the wildlands to reach the border of Scotland. And here, history has recorded a story full of irony and tragedy about human arrogance. The Scots, who were traditional enemies of the English, when they saw their southern neighbor being ravaged by the pestilence, were utterly gleeful. They laughed and called it the foul death of the English, as a punishment from God. They believed they were protected. In early 1350, they gathered a large army in the forest of Selkirk near the border, with the intention of taking this opportunity to invade a weakened England. But before the attack could be launched, the invisible hand of the pestilence crossed the border. It struck the very army that was gathering. The Scottish soldiers fell quickly and devastatingly, right where they were assembled. The invading army was destroyed, not by English swords, but by the very enemy they had mocked. This story is a cold reminder that the Black Death did not distinguish between nations, races, or pride. It was an ultimate trial for all of humanity, a storm that no one could stand outside of. Part 7. When the Ashes Settled. After ravaging England and sowing tragedy in Scotland, the Black Death still did not stop. It was like a fire that could not be extinguished. It could only burn itself out after consuming everything in its path. From the eastern ports of England, it boarded the ships of merchants and Vikings, crossing the cold North Sea to reach the lands of Scandinavia. The city of Bergen in Norway, one of the most important trading ports of the north, became one of the first victims. Stories are told of English merchant ships found drifting aimlessly at sea. When people towed them ashore, inside was only a deathly silence and bodies ravaged by the pestilence. From the port cities, it began to seep deep into the interior, following narrow valleys and icy rivers. It reached even the most remote villages, hidden high in the mountains. A tragic story is recorded about a village called Setesdal in Norway. This place was hit so hard by the epidemic that almost everyone died. Months later, when a relief party from elsewhere arrived, they walked through an overwhelming silence, empty houses, and they found only one person left alive. A young girl named Rapé, living alone in the wilderness for so long, having witnessed all her loved ones pass away. The little girl had suffered too great a psychological shock. She had forgotten how to communicate like a human and lived like a creature of the forest, hunting to survive. The story of Rapé, though only a small piece of the puzzle, shows us another mystery, the mystery of loneliness and the mental devastation the pandemic left on the survivors. Their pain was greater than any statistic. Meanwhile, on the other side of Europe, the pestilence was also completing its arc. It entered the lands of Poland and Eastern Europe. And here, another interesting mystery appears. It seems that Poland was not as severely affected as the rest of Europe. The mortality rate here was significantly lower. Why was that? No one has a certain answer, but a few theories have been proposed. The first theory suggests that the king of Poland at the time, Casimir the Great, was a wise and decisive ruler. He recognized the danger early and ordered the borders of his kingdom to be strictly closed. He established a harsh quarantine system. Anyone within Polish territory who showed the first signs of the plague would be forced to stay in their homes. There are even records saying that their doors were walled up, turning their houses into the tombs of themselves and their families. A very cruel measure, but it may have been effective in preventing community spread. The second theory is more interesting, suggesting that Poland had a natural advantage: a large number of cats. It is thought that with a large cat population, the rat population in Poland was kept at a low level. Fewer rats meant fewer fleas, and therefore, the main transmission route of bubonic plague was limited. Whatever the truth may be, Poland was luckier than its neighbors. Finally, around the year 1352, after having made a circuit of almost all of Europe, the Black Death reached the gates of Moscow. From here, it seemed to have lost its initial strength. It gradually retreated back to the vast Central Asian steppes, where it had begun. The storm had finally passed. The fire had finally died down. Europe, and a large part of the world, was now engulfed in a heart-wrenching silence. When the ashes settled, people began to count the losses. The numbers were truly beyond imagination. It is estimated that in Europe alone, about 1/3 to 1/2 of the population was gone. The number could be as high as 50 million people. But Europe was not the only place. The pestilence had also devastated the Middle East, North Africa, and Asia. Modern historians estimate that, worldwide, there may have been up to 200 million deaths, while the global population at the time was only about 500 million. Nearly half of humanity was wiped out in just a few years. These numbers are so large they become abstract, hard to feel, because behind every number is a life, a story, a family that was permanently extinguished. The world had sunk into a silence of loss. But it was from this very silence, from this emptiness, that a great paradox, a final mystery of history, began to form. Part 8, The Paradox of the Ashes, Dawn from Destruction. The biggest question, and also the deepest mystery left by the Black Death, is a paradox. How, from an event of such absolute destruction, could positive changes arise, and even a glorious era? How, from the ashes of death, could new life be reborn, not merely recovering, but becoming stronger and more dynamic than before? To understand this paradox, we need to look at the world before the pandemic occurred. Europe in the mid-14th century, according to many historians, was caught in a Malthusian trap. This means the population had grown to a point where it nearly exceeded the capacity of its agriculture to provide. Land became scarce. The standard of living for most people was stagnating or declining. Poverty and malnutrition were widespread. The social structure was incredibly rigid, with a feudal system and serfdom that had existed for centuries. The majority of the people were serfs, bound to the land of their lords, with no freedom of movement, and having to toil just for a small share of the harvest and protection. Social mobility was almost non-existent. A person born a serf would almost certainly die a serf. Innovation in technology and thought was stifled. The Black Death, cruelly and unintentionally, broke this deadlock. It was a great and painful reset. Let's consider the changes in the economy. When half of the labor force suddenly disappeared, the laws of supply and demand in the market changed dramatically. Labor, which had been cheap and abundant, suddenly became incredibly scarce and valuable. The surviving peasants and artisans suddenly held a power that their ancestors never had: the power of negotiation. They could demand higher wages from the lords, better working conditions. If a lord refused, they could simply leave that land and go to another place where other lords were desperate for workers. But for the first time, the value of labor surpassed the value of land. A peasant's scythe could now be worth more than a knight's sword. Serfdom, which was based on binding people to the land, lost its foundation for existence and began to disintegrate across Western Europe. The peasants gained their freedom, and their income increased. They could accumulate wealth, buy more land, and leave property to their children. A new middle class, composed of well-off farmers, merchants, and skilled artisans, rose powerfully. They had economic power, and they yearned for a corresponding social and cultural status. Even the position of women was elevated. With a shortage of male labor, women had to take on roles traditionally reserved for men in agriculture, commerce, and craft guilds. They gained more opportunities and independence. Besides the economy, change also occurred in the realm of thought and culture. The shock of the pandemic shook faith in all the old institutions of power. The church, which was the center of spiritual life, could not stop the pestilence. Prayers seemed to go unanswered. The prestige of the clergy declined. This sowed the seeds of doubt and paved the way for the religious reform movements that would erupt later, like the Reformation of Martin Luther. Medicine also experienced a similar crisis. The complete failure of ancient medical theories forced a new generation of doctors to abandon old dogmas. They began to trust more in direct observation, in dissecting human bodies to understand their true structure, and in systematically recording symptoms. These were the first steps on the road to modern evidence-based medicine. And perhaps most importantly, was the change in how people viewed life and death. Having faced death everywhere, people began to appreciate life on this earth more. They no longer focused only on a life in the hereafter, but wanted to enjoy and explore the present world. Humanism, a philosophy that places human beings at the center, began to blossom. Art no longer served only religion, but began to celebrate the beauty of the human body, of nature, and of personal emotions. The historian John Kelly summarized this paradox very well. He wrote, "Horrific as a century of unremitting death had been, Europe was able to emerge from the charnel house of pestilence, renewed, like the sun after the rain. The Black Death broke the deadlock which, without it, might have kept Europe in its traditional ways for an indefinite future. This is the greatest paradox. From the utmost destruction, a new dawn was born." As we come to the end of our journey tonight, the mist of the past seems to have lifted somewhat, but not entirely. We have explored together the great mysteries that have shaped the story of the Black Death. The mystery of its origin, a starting point still lying somewhere in the misty steppes of Asia. the mystery of its destructive power, of its ability to transform between different forms of the disease, and of the suspicion that it did not act alone, the mystery of human psychology, when faced with chaos and ultimate fear, where courage and cruelty existed side by side. And finally, the greatest mystery, the paradox of rebirth, of how a glorious dawn of the Renaissance was born from the darkest night of the Middle Ages. The Black Death was not just a historical event. It was a fundamental turning point for Western civilization. It did not just take lives. It killed an old world, an old social order, an old way of thinking. And from that void, it created space for new things to arise. Its story is a profound reminder of the fragility of the societies we build, of how the world is connected by invisible threads, and how a small event in a distant place can change the fate of us all. But it is also a story of the incredible resilience and recovery of human beings. After having gone through an unimaginable tragedy, humanity did not fall. They stood up, learned, rebuilt, and created a new world from the very ashes of the past. As you drift off to sleep, let these echoes remain in your mind, not as frightening stories, but as deep lessons about history, about human nature, and about the ever-changing flow of life. Where darkness and light, destruction and creation are always part of the same great story. And the mysteries of the past will always be there, inviting us to listen and to ponder in the stillness of the night.